Section 1. The arrival of trouble at the guest cabin. The morning sun had barely crested the pine-covered hills surrounding my guest cabin when I first noticed the familiar but unwelcome figure of Karen Thompson, the neighborhood's notorious HOA enforcer, striding purposefully along the winding dirt path that led to my property, her heels crunching against the gravel with a deliberate rhythm that seemed to announce not just her presence, but the beginning of yet another orchestrated confrontation. I had spent the weekend preparing for a quiet retreat, a chance to disconnect from the chaos of suburban rules and petty rivalries, arranging firewood neatly by the porch, hanging bird feeders along the edge of the deck, and stocking the cabin with supplies for a few days of solitude. Yet the tranquility I had worked so hard to cultivate was already under threat. Karen, as usual, had arrived uninvited, her clipboard clutched tightly in one hand, a pen poised as if ready to record infractions that only she could imagine, her eyes scanning every detail with a mixture of scrutiny and disdain that I had come to recognize over years of enduring her overreach. The cabin, nestled in the woods but within the HOA's jurisdiction, was meant to be a private getaway, a space where rules about paint colors, mailbox alignment, and fence heights held no weight beyond courtesy, yet Karen seemed intent on imposing her brand of authority as if the forest itself owed her deference. Her gaze swept across the lawn, pausing on the carefully arranged flower pots, the stacked firewood, and the rustic charm of the cabin's exterior, and I could feel her internal judgment radiating toward me even before she opened her mouth. Her first words, sharp and clipped, cut through the morning air like a serrated blade. "You know this isn't allowed. You can't use this property as a guest cabin without proper approval. You're violating HOA regulations." I stepped onto the porch, coffee in hand, attempting to maintain a calm demeanor, but the tension in my chest was unmistakable. I had anticipated some level of interference. Karen rarely missed an opportunity to assert her dominance, but her escalation to threatening eviction was new, alarming, and outright audacious. I explained that the cabin was my own property, that all local permits were in order, and that the structure had been compliant with every known regulation, yet Karen, as always, was immune to reason. Her eyes narrowed, her lips pressing into a thin line, and she brandished her clipboard like a sword, rattling off citations, bylaws, and vague threats about fines and legal action, her voice rising with each sentence as if volume could substitute for legitimacy. She paced in front of the cabin, tapping her pen against the wood railing, her presence oppressive, leaving no space for clarity, logic, or calm. The birds that had been chirping in the early morning now fell silent, as if even nature recoiled from her intrusion, and the wind seemed to falter in its usual dance through the pine needles. My neighbors' cabins, tucked into the surrounding hills, remained empty for the weekend, leaving me alone with her scrutiny, amplifying the isolation that Karen seemed to relish exploiting. For a brief moment, I considered retreating inside, shutting the door, and hoping she would leave, but her persistent gaze, the set of her jaw, and the intensity of her presence made it clear that she would not depart without confrontation. I reminded her politely yet firmly that the sheriff had previously confirmed my compliance with all regulations, but her response was dismissive, her tone dripping with contempt, as she claimed that the HOA had new oversight powers, vague amendments, and special authority to enforce her will. The heat of indignation rose in me, but I maintained my composure, aware that any misstep could be spun as provocation in her narrative. As the morning wore on, Karen's tactics grew increasingly aggressive. She began circling the cabin, photographing minor details, noting cracks in the wood, misaligned shutters, even the slight tilt of a flower pot, all in an effort to build a dossier that could be used against me. Her intensity was almost theatrical, as if she believed that relentless scrutiny would intimidate me into abandoning my rightful property. I watched her, silently recording her actions with my phone, documenting the absurdity, knowing that evidence was my only shield against her habitual overreach. Hours passed with Karen relentlessly inspecting, threatening, and writing notes, each moment amplifying the emotional weight of the situation. My attempts to reason with her were met with feigned disinterest and escalating threats, her voice rising in pitch, her gestures becoming sharper and more demanding. I realized that this was not merely about rules. It was about power, control, and the sadistic pleasure she derived from dominating those who refused to submit. My patience strained, I felt the rising tide of frustration mixed with anxiety, but just as Karen was preparing to call the HOA's enforcement team to remove me from my own property, a sudden rumble of sirens cut through the tense morning air, breaking the spell of intimidation she had woven so meticulously. The sound grew louder, punctuated by flashing lights visible between the trees, and my heart lifted with a surge of relief and anticipation. Within minutes, a sheriff's vehicle rolled to a stop in front of the cabin, and the officers emerged with authoritative calm, their presence immediately deflating Karen's bravado. She froze mid-sentence, pen still hovering over her clipboard, her usual assertive posture replaced by the unmistakable rigidity of panic. The sheriff, familiar with the neighborhood and aware of Karen's history of overreach, approached me first, confirming that all permits were in order and that no violation had occurred. Karen, realizing that her ability to intimidate had been nullified by law enforcement, attempted to interject, waving her clipboard and claiming urgency, but the officers' firm gestures and measured voices left no room for negotiation. They instructed her to step back, to cease her threats, and to refrain from further interference, emphasizing that any attempt to remove me or restrict my access would be considered harassment and could result in legal consequences. Karen's face went pale, her carefully constructed mask of authority crumbling as she realized that her habitual tactics were powerless in the face of law, documentation, and procedural clarity. For the first time in years, she experienced the profound frustration of being unable to dominate, unable to assert control, and unable to bend rules to her will. The tension, which had escalated to near unbearable levels throughout the morning, began to dissipate as the sheriff confirmed that the cabin was compliant, that I had the right to occupy it freely, and that any attempt by Karen to challenge this order would be met with legal enforcement. Relief washed over me, a mixture of vindication and exhaustion as the surreal ordeal finally began to resolve. Karen, realizing that her authority had been thoroughly undermined, gathered her papers in a trembling flurry, muttering incoherent threats and excuses, and retreated down the dirt path she had so confidently marched along just hours before. The officers remained briefly, ensuring the situation had stabilized, and then departed with a quiet professionalism that contrasted sharply with Karen's chaotic energy. As I watched her figure fade into the trees, I felt a profound sense of liberation and resilience, knowing that not only had I maintained my rightful claim to the cabin, but that the law had reinforced the principle that overreach, obsession, and intimidation would not go unchallenged. The forest around the cabin returned to its natural rhythm. Birds resumed their chirping, the wind rustled through the pines, and the quiet of the morning, once threatened by Karen's disruptive presence, was restored, leaving behind the sweet satisfaction of justice, vindication, and the reaffirmation of boundaries firmly grounded in legality and common sense. Section 2, Karen's escalating schemes and the sheriff's oversight the day, following Karen Thompson's humiliating confrontation at my guest cabin, the neighborhood seemed to hold its collective breath, as if expecting her next move. And indeed, Karen did not disappoint. From the moment she retreated down the forested path, a storm of obsessive plotting and frantic strategizing took hold, her mind spinning through increasingly desperate tactics designed to reclaim the sense of authority she had so publicly lost. Seated at her kitchen table, surrounded by piles of HOA bylaws, outdated regulations, and her own scribbled notes, Karen mapped out a plan that she believed would intimidate, confuse, and ultimately force me to abandon the cabin. A strategy built on threats of fines, legal maneuvering, and the manipulation of perceived loopholes in zoning laws. Each page she turned, each scribble she added, seemed to escalate her sense of entitlement, as though her obsessive desire for control could somehow override the clear reality established by the sheriff's presence and the documentation of my compliance. She made multiple phone calls to the HOA, leaving a trail of frantic voicemails and misrepresentations of the events at my cabin, attempting to frame me as noncompliant, disruptive, or even unlawful. Yet the board, Now keenly aware of her habitual overreach and the documented evidence of her intrusion, responded with careful neutrality, refusing to act without clear legal justification and explicitly warning her that further harassment could result in personal liability. This lack of support, a stark contrast to the unquestioning obedience she had previously received from neighbors and board members, fueled her frustration and sent her into a whirlwind of escalating obsession as she imagined increasingly elaborate schemes to enforce compliance where none was warranted. In the neighborhood, whispers spread like wildfire. Observers recounted Karen's retreat from my cabin, the presence of the sheriff, and the glaring contrast between her authoritative facade and the undeniable reality of her powerless position. Neighbors, who had often been silent witnesses to her petty tirades, were emboldened by the sheriff's intervention, discussing openly how Karen's obsessive control had escalated beyond mere HOA enforcement into intimidation and harassment. Some residents had even begun to share their own experiences, tales of arbitrary fines, surprise inspections, and manipulative communications, weaving together a tapestry of long-suppressed frustration that now found expression in solidarity. Children played without fear of sudden admonishments, families tended their gardens without worry, and the forested pathways near my cabin became spaces of quiet freedom, all underscored by the knowledge that Karen's capacity to exert arbitrary authority had been effectively neutralized. Yet Karen, blinded by obsession, remained unaware of this shift, perceiving every neighborly interaction as a potential threat to her plans and every quiet moment as a lapse in her control, compelling her to double down on increasingly desperate tactics. Determined to regain the upper hand, Karen decided to escalate her campaign beyond mere complaints. She attempted to file legal notices claiming that my use of the cabin violated zoning laws or HOA covenants that, upon close inspection, were either misinterpreted or entirely irrelevant to my property. Each submission was meticulously documented by both the sheriff's office and the HOA board, who began creating a detailed record of her repeated attempts at harassment, understanding that the cumulative evidence could have serious legal consequences. Karen's miscalculations compounded her frustration. She was operating under the delusion that bureaucratic intimidation could substitute for proof, unaware that her frantic filings, contradictory statements, and repeated harassment were building a legal case against her. At this point, Karen's mental state began to reflect the chaos she had unleashed in the neighborhood. Her obsession fueled sleepless nights, erratic communications, and increasingly irrational demands, all of which were observed by neighbors with a mixture of disbelief, amusement, and cautious concern. The pattern of her behavior revealed a woman trapped by her own obsession, incapable of recognizing the consequences of her actions, and unable to grasp that the combined vigilance of the sheriff, the HOA board, and the neighborhood had created an impenetrable barrier against her manipulations. Meanwhile, the sheriff maintained regular patrols around the cabin, both to reassure me and to ensure that Karen's escalating tactics did not cross legal boundaries. His presence, professional and unobtrusive, served as a deterrent, a reminder that overreach would be met with enforcement rather than intimidation. When Karen attempted to approach the cabin again under the pretext of inspection or compliance checks, she was met with calm but firm instructions to step back, leave the property, and cease all contact, each interaction reinforcing the message that her habitual methods of domination were no longer effective. Witnesses from nearby cabins, now fully aware of Karen's history and current actions, documented her visits, further limiting her options and reinforcing her growing isolation. For the first time, she experienced the profound frustration of being denied the leverage she had long relied upon, her sense of entitlement clashing with the reality of accountability, and the mounting evidence that her obsession had consequences. Even as Karen's schemes intensified, the community's confidence grew. Neighbors began coordinating informal communications to monitor her behavior, ensuring that any attempt to interfere with my cabin or other properties would be noticed and documented. Shared vigilance became a quiet but powerful force, transforming fear and uncertainty into proactive measures that reinforced the safety and stability of the neighborhood. Social gatherings, once overshadowed by anxiety about HOA interventions, began to thrive, with residents openly discussing best practices for protecting property, maintaining compliance, and ensuring personal safety without resorting to confrontation. Karen's presence, while still unsettling, no longer carried the authority she once wielded. Her threats were met with calm resistance, her filings were scrutinized and dismissed where appropriate, and her attempts at intimidation were countered with documentation and legal oversight. By the end of this period, Karen's obsessive campaign had reached a point of diminishing returns. Her communications were increasingly frantic and incoherent, her legal filings dismissed or ignored due to lack of merit, and her ability to influence the neighborhood effectively nullified. The sheriff's consistent oversight, coupled with the HOA board's measured response and the community's solidarity, created an environment in which Karen's obsession could no longer produce fear or compliance. What had begun as a personal confrontation at a single guest cabin had transformed into a larger story of accountability, resilience, and the power of collective action. The cabin, my sanctuary amidst the pines, remained intact, functional, and mine, a symbol not only of property rights, but of the triumph of law, preparation, and communal vigilance over arbitrary tyranny. Karen's obsession, though persistent, had been neutralized by evidence, oversight, and the simple but profound principle that no individual, regardless of title or perceived authority, can impose their will unchecked when a community is united and the law is clear. Section 3. Karen's desperate moves and the community's stand. By the time midweek arrived, Karen Thompson's obsession with asserting control over my guest cabin had escalated to levels that were both alarming and, in a strange way, almost pitiable, as her repeated failures to intimidate or manipulate the HOA board, the sheriff, and the neighborhood had begun to warp her normally commanding demeanor into a frantic, almost desperate energy that could be felt radiating from her whenever she appeared near the property. She spent hours poring over HOA documents, legal codes, and even obscure municipal regulations, cross-referencing clauses, and noting supposed loopholes that she could exploit to fabricate a basis for eviction or fines, convinced that some obscure rule would give her the leverage she had so sorely lost. Karen began showing up at the cabin in increasingly brazen ways, attempting early morning inspections before the sun had fully risen, midday visits when shadows were sharpest, and late afternoon approaches when fatigue might compromise my alertness, each time armed with her clipboard, her smartphone, and a barrage of repetitive warning citations and threats designed to unsettle and intimidate, yet each time she was met with the calm, unwavering presence of law enforcement or neighbor. Vigilance that left her visibly unsettled, her carefully curated aura of control crumbling like brittle ice under relentless pressure. She would pace the periphery of the property, tapping pens, taking notes, speaking in low mutters as though recording every minor imperfection as evidence for her imagined case, all while the forest itself seemed to mock her, the wind rustling through the pine trees, birds chirping with apparent nonchalance, and leaves shifting in patterns that contrasted sharply with her frantic energy, a subtle reminder that life, rules, and order existed beyond her obsessive gaze. Her attempts to enlist other neighbors in her campaign of intimidation proved similarly fruitless. Where once a casual suggestion or a whispered warning could instill fear and compliance, now the residents of the area, emboldened by the sheriff's oversight and the transparent legality of my cabin status, responded with firm but polite refusals, sometimes even laughter at her increasingly erratic behavior, further destabilizing her sense of authority. Karen's desperation transformed her social interactions into chaotic negotiations, where she alternated between pleading, threatening, and attempting to manipulate emotions in an effort to find an ally who would validate her version of events, yet each attempt ended in failure, leaving her more isolated and frustrated than before. Even the HOA board, which she had previously dominated through a combination of intimidation and selective enforcement, maintained a formal but resolute stance, reinforcing that all actions must adhere to law and fact, and that any personal vendetta would not be tolerated. This collective resistance, while not overtly confrontational, created an invisible but unbreakable barrier that Karen could neither circumvent nor intimidate, and each failed attempt only intensified the internal spiral of obsession and irrationality that drove her increasingly erratic behavior. During this period, the sheriff's involvement proved critical in both preventing escalation and restoring a sense of security. officers increased patrols around the cabin, documented Karen's repeated approaches, and advised me on procedures to further protect my property, all while maintaining a professional distance that emphasized authority without unnecessary provocation. Their presence created a tangible limitation on Karen's actions, nullifying her usual reliance on fear, surprise, and manipulation to gain compliance, and ensuring that any further harassment could be formally documented and used as evidence for potential legal consequences. Karen, fully aware of this oversight, yet undeterred by the growing legal risks, shifted tactics towards subtler forms of harassment, sending confusing, contradictory emails, posting cryptic messages on neighborhood forums, and attempting to manipulate the perceptions of casual observers with misleading claims about my compliance status, all in a futile effort to regain psychological leverage. Each attempt, meticulously recorded by both myself and the neighbors, only compounded the evidence of her obsessive overreach, providing a growing dossier that reinforced the community's position and her eventual accountability. The neighborhood itself had entered a state of quiet but firm vigilance. Residents coordinated informal patrols of shared paths, exchanged updates about Karen's activity, and discuss collectively how to respond to her escalating antics without provoking unnecessary confrontation. The once tense undercurrent of fear that had characterized interactions with Karen transformed into a sense of shared empowerment, a knowledge that the community, when united, could resist and neutralize her obsessive efforts without conflict or legal ambiguity. Children played freely in yards and along pathways, neighbors tended their properties without fear of unexpected citations, and shared gatherings, previously muted by apprehension, now thrived as expressions of collective resilience. Karen's presence, while still unnerving to some, no longer commanded the same automatic compliance. Her threats fell on ears fortified by law, evidence, and the solidarity of a vigilant community. Amid this backdrop, Karen's actions became progressively reckless. She attempted to access the cabin's driveway without permission, claiming in shouted, frantic declarations that she had special authority granted by the HOA, only to be met by neighbors documenting the encounter and promptly notifying the sheriff. Her attempts to intimidate through ambiguous legal references or convoluted interpretations of covenants were systematically dismantled by the officers who patiently explained the facts, cited verified permits, and made it clear that any attempt to act outside the law would carry immediate consequences. Karen's frustration manifested in visible tremors, muttered curses, and the kind of panicked pacing that suggested a person teetering on the edge of obsession-driven collapse. Despite this, the neighborhood remained composed, functioning as a shield of normalcy, order, and legal clarity that steadily eroded Karen's confidence and sense of influence. By the end of this intense period, Karen's obsession had reached a fever pitch, yet the mechanisms of law, community oversight, and personal vigilance ensured that her schemes could not succeed. She had become a figure of erratic desperation rather than authority, her every action carefully monitored, documented, and countered, leaving her isolated and increasingly aware of the futility of her campaign. The cabin, my sanctuary in the woods, remained untouched, protected not only by permits and legal compliance, but by a collective network of observant neighbors and law enforcement officers committed to preventing harassment. Karen's obsession, once a source of intimidation and disruption, had now become an instrument of her own exposure and eventual accountability, proving that relentless documentation, community solidarity, and unwavering adherence to the law could neutralize even the most determined attempts at control. The tension remained, but it was no longer one-sided. The neighborhood, emboldened and vigilant, had reclaimed its agency, transforming fear into preparedness, suspicion into empowerment, and uncertainty into resolute confidence that justice and order would prevail regardless of Karen Thompson's obsession. Section 4, Karen's final desperate confrontations and the sheriff's intervention. As the days stretched into another tense week, Karen Thompson's obsession with asserting dominion over my guest cabin escalated to an intensity that bordered on mania, her every thought seemingly consumed by how she could circumvent legal oversight, manipulate neighborhood perceptions, and reclaim the authority that had been stripped from her by both the sheriff's intervention and the unwavering documentation of Her previous actions, no longer satisfied with mere verbal threats or ambiguous filings, Karen began orchestrating elaborate schemes in her mind, pacing the confines of her home while drafting intricate plans of harassment disguised as inspections, community outreach, or administrative oversight, believing that she could create scenarios in which the lines of legality and intimidation blurred just enough for her to regain leverage. She even attempted to exploit minor ambiguities in the HOA's covenants, poring over obscure clauses regarding property usage, setbacks, and occupancy limits, all in a feverish attempt to fabricate a legal foothold that would justify removing me from my own cabin. Each attempt at strategizing, however, was met with the cold reality that law enforcement, the HOA board, and the neighborhood itself were alert, coordinated, and unyielding. The sheriff's office, having witnessed her previous attempts at intimidation, maintained routine patrols, documented every approach, and explicitly warned Karen that further interference could result in criminal charges, effectively neutralizing any attempts to use fear as a weapon. Despite this, Karen's obsession propelled her forward. Her mind convinced that persistence alone could bend reality, that her tireless focus on minor infractions could somehow produce the desired outcome of eviction or compliance, and that the law and community vigilance were merely obstacles to be overcome with sufficient cunning and determination. Her physical presence near the cabin grew increasingly aggressive, a testament to her desperation and declining patience. Karen would arrive at the edge of the property in the early morning, pretending to conduct inspections or take measurements, her clipboard poised as a symbol of authority while her gaze swept the surroundings with obsessive scrutiny, searching for any perceived imperfection that could be leveraged as justification for further action. She paced the perimeter, taking photographs of minor discrepancies, noting weathered boards, misaligned shutters, or leaves on the walkway, convinced that accumulation of trivial evidence could produce tangible consequences. Yet, each visit was met with calm yet firm responses from neighbors and law enforcement, their presence a barrier that rendered her intimidation ineffective. When she attempted to confront me directly, her voice trembled with both anger and frustration, oscillating between feigned authority, pleading insistence, and thinly veiled threats. Yet every word was systematically documented, countered, or ignored, leaving her isolated in a pattern of obsession that only heightened her sense of inadequacy. Karen also tried to exploit the HOA board's processes, submitting lengthy, convoluted complaints with attachments of photographs, references to minor or irrelevant clauses, and repeated demands for intervention. The board, however, remained unwavering, carefully reviewing her submissions, dismissing irrelevant claims, and reinforcing the principle that property rights permits and legal compliance were paramount. Her attempts to manipulate these bureaucratic processes were rendered powerless not through confrontation, but through careful procedure, transparency, and the consistent application of rules, a methodical approach that starkly contrasted with Karen's frantic, emotional, and increasingly erratic tactics. Each rejection further fueled her obsession. As she became convinced that she had discovered loopholes or procedural errors that were being ignored, her mental energy consumed by a relentless need to regain control that only served to highlight her vulnerability and growing instability. The sheriff's role became central during this period, providing both oversight and reassurance. Officers routinely monitored the cabin, responding promptly to any indication that Karen might approach or attempt unauthorized entry, documenting interactions, and reminding her, both formally and informally, of the legal consequences of harassment or trespass. Their presence was a constant, visible deterrent, effectively dismantling any strategy of intimidation she might attempt. Even as Karen tried subtle tactics such as walking the perimeter at a distance, lingering near neighboring properties, or sending threatening communications masquerading as administrative inquiries, the coordinated vigilance of law enforcement, the HOA board, and neighborhood observers created a barrier that was nearly impossible to penetrate. Each failed attempt amplified Karen's sense of frustration, her obsession pushing her to ever more irrational behaviors, which in turn further documented her pattern of harassment and increased the likelihood of legal consequences. Meanwhile, the neighborhood had transformed into a cohesive and vigilant community. Residents communicated openly about Karen's actions, coordinating responses to her presence, sharing updates, and collectively monitoring her behavior without direct confrontation. Families, previously hesitant to challenge her authority, were now emboldened, observing that persistence, evidence, and community solidarity effectively countered intimidation. Children played safely in yards, neighbors tended gardens, and informal gatherings thrived, all underscored by the knowledge that Karen's capacity to disrupt or intimidate had been neutralized by law and collective vigilance. Karen's frantic efforts, once capable of spreading fear, now elicited little more than exasperation and quiet amusement from those who had once been her targets. The climax of this period occurred when Karen, in a final, desperate attempt, tried to forcibly assert her authority by approaching the cabin under the pretense of conducting an urgent compliance inspection, believing that surprise and intimidation could bypass the structural protections now in place. She arrived with her clipboard and camera, muttering about violations and the HOA's supposed powers, only to be met immediately by the sheriff, who had been forewarned of her likely approach. The officers intercepted her at the edge of the property, firmly instructing her to leave, explaining that any further attempts to interfere with the cabin or its residents would constitute harassment and be subject to immediate legal action. Karen's face went pale, her hands trembled, and her frantic energy became almost comical in its intensity, revealing the depth of obsession that had driven her behavior for years. She attempted to argue, shout, and manipulate, but the combination of calm authority, legal knowledge, and meticulous documentation rendered her powerless. For the first time, Karen's obsession collided with a reality she could not bend. Her authority had evaporated, her manipulations were ineffective, and the law, combined with a united community, had finally set clear, non-negotiable boundaries. By the end of this confrontation, it was clear that Karen's campaign of harassment and obsession had reached its natural conclusion. She retreated, muttering threats and excuses, her energy spent, her aura of control shattered, and her capacity to influence the neighborhood effectively nullified. The cabin remained secure, undisturbed, and fully within the bounds of legality and personal rights, while the community, emboldened by the sheriff's intervention and their own vigilance, experienced a renewed sense of empowerment and cohesion. The ordeal, though exhausting and tense, had transformed the neighborhood, proving that preparation, documentation, law enforcement, and collective solidarity could neutralize even the most persistent and obsessive attempts at intimidation. Karen's obsession, once a source of anxiety and disruption, had been rendered impotent by the careful application of oversight, the unwavering adherence to legal process, and the resolute unity of the community she sought to dominate. In the quiet aftermath, the forest around the cabin returned to its natural rhythm, birds resumed their songs, and the wind whispered through the trees, a gentle reminder that nature, law, and community vigilance together could restore balance, even in the face of relentless obsession. Section 5, Karen's Downfall and the Neighborhood's Triumph, the final chapter of Karen Thompson's relentless obsession with controlling my guest cabin, unfolded with a mix of tension, vindication, and a quiet, unshakable satisfaction that reverberated through the neighborhood, as if every resident, having silently endured years of petty tyranny and harassment, collectively exhaled a long-held breath of relief now that her manipulations had reached their inevitable conclusion. In the days leading up to the final resolution, Karen's behavior had escalated into a level of erratic desperation that was almost theatrical in its intensity. She was seen pacing outside the cabin at odd hours, muttering to herself, waving her clipboard, making frantic phone calls to the HOA, neighbors, and anyone she could convince might validate her increasingly convoluted claims, and sending letters and emails filled with misrepresentations, threats, and demands, all intended to create a veneer of authority that had long since been stripped from her by both legal oversight and community awareness. Yet each attempt was systematically dismantled by the calm and meticulous enforcement of law, the vigilance of neighbors, and the procedural clarity of the HOA board, whose members refused to be swayed by Karen's dramatic claims or emotional manipulation. The sheriff, fully briefed on her obsessive campaign, maintained visible yet unobtrusive presence, ensuring that any attempt to trespass, intimidate, or harass would result in immediate legal consequences, reinforcing the clear boundary that Karen's authority no longer extended beyond the paper she clutched in her trembling hands. Her once commanding aura of power, cultivated over years of petty enforcement, had evaporated completely, replaced by the unmistakable signs of desperation, frustration, and isolation as she confronted for the first time in her life the reality that persistence, obsession, and aggression could not override law, community solidarity, and documented evidence. The neighborhood, having quietly witnessed her unraveling, had become a bastion of support, vigilance, and collective resolve. Residents coordinated informal monitoring of the cabin and surrounding areas, shared updates about Karen's increasingly erratic behavior, and maintained open lines of communication with both the sheriff and the HOA board, creating a network that ensured every attempt at interference was noted, documented, and addressed promptly. What had once been a source of fear, the idea that Karen could arbitrarily impose fines, inspections, or restrictions, was now neutralized by transparency, accountability, and the visible presence of law enforcement. Children played without fear along the wooded paths, families tended gardens, and neighbors spoke openly about the ordeal with a sense of empowerment, sharing both relief and pride in how effectively the community had defended itself against repeated harassment. Karen's frantic gestures, loud threats, and obsessive pacing were now met with quiet observation, calm documentation, and in some cases polite laughter, all of which further underscored her isolation and diminishing influence. The legal and administrative consequences of her obsession began to accumulate rapidly. Complaints filed against her behavior by neighbors and recorded by law enforcement created an irrefutable dossier of harassment, trespassing attempts, and obsessive interference. The HOA, now thoroughly informed of her repeated violations and manipulative tactics, imposed strict restrictions on her ability to interact with neighborhood properties, while the sheriff's office provided formal warnings, making it explicitly clear that any further attempt to intimidate or infringe upon residents' rights would result in immediate arrest. Karen, caught between her obsession and the unyielding structures of law and community resistance, attempted one final campaign of intimidation, approaching the cabin with her clipboard and camera in hand, muttering about regulations, covenants, and unspecified violations. Yet her efforts were immediately intercepted by the sheriff. Officers calmly but firmly explained that her actions constituted harassment and that she was legally prohibited from entering or interfering with the property, leaving her visibly shaken, her composure shattered, and her authority completely nullified. The combination of legal oversight, HOA enforcement, and neighborhood vigilance had created an impenetrable barrier that rendered her obsession powerless, and in this moment, the full weight of accountability descended upon her, leaving no room for further manipulation or intimidation. In the aftermath of this final confrontation, Karen's pattern of obsessive behavior was publicly documented, creating a record that both protected the community and served as a cautionary tale of what occurs when obsession, entitlement, and disregard for law collide. Her influence over neighbors evaporated, her attempts to intimidate or control were universally dismissed, and her reputation shifted from one of feared authority to a figure of desperate obsession, a cautionary symbol illustrating the limits of power when confronted by law, documentation, and collective vigilance. The cabin, my sanctuary nestled in the woods, remained intact, fully compliant, and free from interference, symbolizing the triumph of preparation, legal compliance, and community solidarity over arbitrary control and personal obsession. Residents who had previously experienced fear or intimidation now felt emboldened, their confidence reinforced by the visible and unambiguous consequences of Karen's actions. The neighborhood's social fabric, once strained by her tyranny, was now strengthened, with open communication, mutual support, and shared vigilance becoming defining characteristics of life in the community. By the end of this chapter, a profound sense of peace settled over the area surrounding the guest cabin. Karen, fully aware that her schemes had failed and that further attempts would only result in legal consequences, retreated into isolation, her obsessive campaign definitively halted by the combined forces of law, community vigilance, and the unwavering enforcement of HOA regulations grounded in fact rather than personal vendetta. The neighborhood, having weathered the storm, emerged stronger, unified, and more resilient, proving that even the most determined and obsessive attempts at control could be neutralized when documentation, law, and solidarity were applied consistently and decisively. The forest around the cabin returned to its serene rhythm. Birds resumed their songs, the wind whispered through the pines, and the tranquility of the morning, once threatened by Karen's relentless obsession, was restored. What had begun as a confrontation steeped in anxiety, frustration, and the threat of harassment concluded as a story of justice served, community triumph, and the reaffirmation of personal and property rights. The cabin stood as a monument to resilience, the sheriff's presence as a symbol of legal protection, and the united neighbors as living proof that obsessive control could be overcome, that authority built on fear was temporary, and that vigilance, preparation, and communal solidarity were the most powerful tools in reclaiming peace, dignity, and freedom. Karen Thompson, once a figure of intimidation, had become a cautionary tale. The neighborhood, once subdued by her obsessive tyranny, had reclaimed both its voice and its joy, demonstrating that no amount of obsession could override law, community, or truth. The sun set over the wooded hills, casting a golden glow over the cabin and the surrounding landscape, a silent testament to resilience, justice, and the enduring power of a community united against harassment, forever marking the conclusion of Karen's relentless, obsessive campaign and the restoration of peace to our corner of the world.